The dimly lit bar hummed with a quiet tension, the kind that could only be found in places where secrets were currency and lives were negotiable. Ethan Cole, a man whose name was whispered more often than spoken aloud, sat nursing a glass of amber liquid. His sharp eyes scanned the room out of habit rather than necessity. The Black Hand's sanctuaries were safe, fortified by layers of anonymity and reputation, but old habits were hard to break for a man who made his living from caution and precision. The stool beside him creaked as a figure slid into place. Without looking up, Ethan recognized the scent of expensive cologne mingled with a faint trace of desperation. The man didn't belong here, too polished, too deliberate. Yet, when the man spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had crossed lines before. "Mr. Cole," the man began, his tone carefully measured, "I hear you're the best." Ethan raised his glass to his lips, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle the man. "Flattery's cheap. Get to the point." Jonathan Myers, as he introduced himself, was not one to waste time. He placed a sleek, encrypted datapad on the counter and slid it toward Ethan. "I have a contract for you. It pays well, very well, but it's unconventional." Ethan finally turned his attention to the man, his expression impassive. "Unconventional how?" Jonathan leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The target is a human." The words hung in the air like a grenade with its pin pulled. Ethan set his glass down, his movements deliberate, and stared at Jonathan with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "You're joking," he said, his voice edged with warning. "I'm not," Jonathan replied, his confidence faltering for the first time. "And I wouldn't have come to you if it wasn't absolutely necessary." Ethan's laugh was low and humorless. "Necessary? Do you have any idea what you're asking? We don't kill humans." Jonathan bristled, his desperation bleeding through. "I've done my research. I know the Black Hand doesn't shy away from the impossible." "The impossible," Ethan said coolly, "is different from the suicidal, and taking a contract on a human falls firmly into the latter category." Jonathan's frustration was palpable. "You don't understand. This man, Daniel Harker, isn't just any human. He's dangerous. Ethan cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Dangerous? To you, maybe. But let me guess. He hasn't hired assassins to come after you. So what makes him so special?" Jonathan hesitated, the flicker of fear in his eyes, betraying something deeper. "He has information, secrets that could unravel everything. Governments, corporations, entire systems. They're all at risk if he's allowed to walk free." Ethan leaned back, his expression unreadable. "If he's such a threat, why not go through official channels? Governments love a good scandal." Jonathan's lips tightened. "He's untouchable. Every attempt to silence him has failed, and now he's gone underground. I need someone with your skill set to finish what others couldn't." Ethan's silence was heavy, his gaze piercing. "Do you know why no one takes contracts on humans?" he asked finally, his voice low but firm. "Because humans don't stop. You kill one, and their family, their friends, their entire damn species will hunt you down. And if that doesn't kill you, their lawyers will." Jonathan looked away, his jaw clenched. "I'll double the payment." Ethan shook his head slowly. "It's not about the money. It's about survival." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the bar, muffled and distant, seemed to amplify the tension between them. Jonathan reached for the datapad, his movements slow, almost defeated. "Think it over," he said, standing. "If you change your mind, you know how to find me." Ethan watched him leave, the polished veneer of the man cracking under the weight of whatever desperation drove him. He didn't touch the datapad, didn't need to. The idea of killing a human was absurd, unthinkable. And yet, as he downed the rest of his drink, a question lingered in his mind. What could make a man like Jonathan Myers so desperate that he'd defy the unspoken rules of the galaxy? As Ethan left the bar, the cold night air hit him like a warning. He wasn't the type to dwell on what-ifs, but something about the way Jonathan had spoken, the way he'd practically begged, planted a seed of unease. Whatever this Daniel Harker was, he wasn't ordinary. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt the faint stirrings of curiosity, a dangerous thing for a man like him. The cold city air lingered as Ethan stepped out of the bar, his mind unsettled. He didn't want to care about Jonathan Myers or his mysterious contract, but something about the man's desperation had snagged at the edges of his thoughts. He was not a man easily drawn to curiosity, and yet the mention of Daniel Harker had a gravity to it that Ethan couldn't entirely ignore. By the next morning, he had resolved to investigate, not out of interest in the contract, but to satisfy his instinct for survival. If Myers was lying, if there was more to this supposed human threat, Ethan needed to know. The rules of the Black Hand weren't just guidelines, they were survival strategies honed over centuries. To break them, Myers had to believe Harker posed a danger unlike any other. Ethan started with the datapad Jonathan had left behind. For all his wealth, Myers had been surprisingly careless about encryption. Within an hour, Ethan had decrypted files containing fragments of surveillance footage, blurry photos, and classified reports. Each one painted an incomplete but troubling picture of Daniel Harker, a quiet man, unremarkable in appearance, moving through the world like a shadow. Yet wherever he went, systems crumbled, financial collapses, corporate scandals, even governmental coups, all seemingly coincidental but tied to his presence. The reports hinted at something deeper: Harker's physical resilience. One grainy video showed him walking away from a car explosion unscathed, his clothes barely singed. Another depicted him in a fistfight with two heavily armed men, dispatching them with an efficiency that was almost mechanical. Ethan replayed the clips multiple times, searching for signs of deception or manipulation, but the evidence felt real, too raw to be staged. Ethan's next step was to observe Harker himself. He tracked the man to a research facility in the city's industrial outskirts, a fortress of concrete and steel surrounded by high fences and patrolled by private security. It was the kind of place that didn't officially exist. For days, Ethan watched from a distance, studying Harker's movements. He worked late hours, often the last to leave, and had a habit of disappearing into unmarked vehicles that never followed the same route twice. Whatever he was involved in, it was meticulous, calculated, traits Ethan recognized in himself. One night, Ethan decided to follow one of those vehicles. He tailed it through winding city streets, keeping a careful distance, until it stopped at a derelict warehouse. Harker stepped out, carrying a case that seemed too heavy for its size, and disappeared inside. Ethan hesitated, weighing the risk, then followed. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of stacked crates and dim lighting, the kind of place where shadows stretched unnaturally long. Ethan moved silently, his senses heightened, until he caught sight of Harker speaking to a group of people. They were dressed plainly, their faces worn with hardship, and their attention was fixed on Harker, as if he were a beacon of hope. Ethan edged closer, straining to hear. "Can't rely on the old systems anymore," Harker was saying, his voice calm but commanding. "We build from the ground up, with no ties to the corruption we've fought so hard to escape." The group murmured in agreement, their loyalty evident. Ethan could see it now. Harker wasn't just dangerous because of what he knew. He was a leader, a symbol of defiance against powers far greater than any single man. For the first time, Ethan felt the weight of what Myers had asked of him. Killing Harker wouldn't just eliminate a threat, it would shatter the fragile hope these people clung to. But there was something else. Ethan's instincts, honed over years of life or death decisions, screamed that Harker wasn't telling the whole truth. The way he moved, the precision in his gestures, it all suggested a deeper, more calculated agenda. Ethan needed to know more before deciding whether to walk away or take the contract. His opportunity came sooner than expected. On another surveillance night, Ethan caught sight of an unmarked van pulling up to the research facility. 4 men exited, their movements too synchronized to be anything but military. They entered the building without hesitation, and within minutes, alarms blared. Harker emerged moments later, flanked by two of his colleagues, his expression grim. The three headed for an emergency exit, but the armed men intercepted them. Ethan watched from the shadows as the confrontation unfolded. Harker's colleagues were subdued quickly, their resistance futile. But Harker moved like lightning, disarming one of the intruders and using the weapon against the others with an efficiency that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. This wasn't just someone with above-average reflexes. This was training, advanced, lethal, and far beyond what any civilian should possess. When the fight was over, Harker stood alone, breathing heavily but otherwise unharmed. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the shadows, as if sensing Ethan's presence. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and Ethan felt an unfamiliar jolt of unease. Harker didn't just see him. He seemed to recognize him, as though he'd been expecting Ethan all along. Ethan slipped away before Harker could make a move, his mind racing. This was no ordinary man. Harker was a survivor, a fighter, and perhaps something more. If he chose to take the contract, it wouldn't be just another job. It would be a war, and for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't sure if he wanted to win. Ethan didn't waste time. His instincts told him that the events he had just witnessed demanded answers, and for the first time, he felt the pull of something beyond the job, a curiosity that gnawed at him. He wasn't a man given to moral dilemmas or existential questions, but Daniel Harker had stirred something unfamiliar. That man was more than a mystery. He was an anomaly. Ethan decided the only way forward was direct confrontation. Tracking Harker wasn't the problem. The man was careful, but Ethan had spent years perfecting his craft, and every precaution Harker took was a textbook move Ethan had seen countless times. It was late when Ethan finally cornered him in an empty parking lot, the faint hum of a street lamp the only sound breaking the silence. Harker emerged from his vehicle, pausing the moment he saw Ethan leaning against a concrete pillar, arms crossed. "You've been following me," Harker said, his voice calm, devoid of fear. "You're not making it easy," Ethan replied, stepping forward, "but I think we both know I'm not just another shadow in your rearview mirror." Harker tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "No, you're not. You're Blackhand." Ethan stopped short, his muscles tensing at the name. Few outside the guild dared to utter it, and even fewer did so without trembling. Yet, Harker said it with a strange familiarity, as if he'd been expecting Ethan all along. "So you know why I'm here," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I can guess," Harker replied, leaning casually against the car door. "The question is whether you're here to talk or to finish what others couldn't." Ethan studied him carefully. Harker wasn't bluffing. His posture was relaxed, but there was an undercurrent of readiness in every movement, a subtle tension that spoke of training and experience. Ethan chose his next words carefully. "I'm not here to kill you," he said finally. "Not yet, anyway. But I need to know, what's the real story? Who are you? And why are people like Myers so desperate to see you dead?" Harker's smile faded, replaced by something colder, more calculating. "You're asking questions you're not ready to hear the answers to." "Try me," Harker sighed, glancing around the deserted lot as if considering his options. Finally, he gestured toward the car. "Get in. If we're going to talk, we're not doing it out here." Ethan hesitated only briefly before sliding into the passenger seat. The interior of the car was nondescript, but the faint scent of ozone lingered, evidence of the advanced technology hidden beneath the dashboard. Harker started the engine, and they drove in silence, the city lights fading as they headed toward the industrial outskirts. Eventually, they pulled into an abandoned warehouse, one far removed from the one Ethan had previously scouted. Inside, Harker motioned for Ethan to follow him to a hidden room, its walls lined with holographic monitors displaying an array of data, maps, satellite imagery, and cryptic symbols Ethan couldn't immediately decipher. Harker didn't wait for Ethan to comment. "My name isn't important," Harker began, his tone clipped. "Harker, what matters is what I represent. You've seen the reports. You know I've survived things that should have killed me. That's not an accident." Ethan folded his arms, leaning against a table as he watched Harker intently. "Go on," I was part of a government experiment, Harker continued. Decades ago, they tried to create something better, stronger, faster, more resilient, a weapon they could control. And you were the result, Ethan said, his voice laced with skepticism. One of them, Harker corrected. There were others, but most of them didn't survive the process. Those of us who did were considered successes, at least until we started questioning orders. Ethan frowned. You're saying you were military? Not exactly, Harker replied, his expression darkening. We were tools, assets, disposable as far as they were concerned. When I realized the kind of atrocities they wanted us to commit, I walked away, or at least I tried to. Turns out they don't let their experiments retire. And now they want you dead, Ethan said, piecing it together. Because you know too much. Harker nodded. Not just about the experiments, about everything. Corruption, black ops missions, things that could bring entire governments to their knees. Myers is just a puppet. The real players are the ones pulling his strings. Ethan considered this, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to fit, but they raised more questions than answers. If you're such a threat, why haven't they succeeded in taking you out? Harker's lips curled into a wry smile. Because I'm good at what I do, and because I'm not alone. Ethan stiffened at the implication. You have allies. More than allies, Harker said, his eyes gleaming. There are others like me, people who've been wronged, betrayed, experimented on, and discarded. We've been building something, quietly, carefully. We're not just surviving anymore. We're preparing. Preparing for what? Ethan asked, though he already suspected the answer. Harker stepped closer, his gaze unflinching. For the day when they come for us. When they think they can wipe us out and bury the truth for good. That day is coming, Ethan. And when it does, you'll have to decide which side you're on. The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt the unfamiliar stirrings of doubt. He had always operated in shades of gray, his moral compass guided only by the parameters of the job. But Harker's conviction, his unwavering certainty, was unsettling. This wasn't a man running for his life. This was a man fighting for something far bigger than himself. Ethan didn't respond immediately, his silence a shield against the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. Harker didn't press him, simply stepping back and folding his arms. You don't have to decide now, Harker said, but you're in this whether you like it or not. They'll know you've spoken to me, and they won't take chances. If you value your life, you'll stay out of their way, or you'll pick a side. Ethan pushed off the table, his expression unreadable. I don't pick sides, he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Harker didn't reply, watching as Ethan turned and walked out of the warehouse, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on his shoulders. As Ethan disappeared into the night, one thought echoed in his mind, louder than all the rest. Harker wasn't just a target, he was a tipping point, and whether Ethan liked it or not, the balance was shifting. The night seemed heavier than usual as Ethan sat in his car, staring blankly at the city skyline. His meeting with Daniel Harker replayed in his mind, every word and detail gnawing at him. For years, he had prided himself on clarity, on knowing who he was and what he did. But now, the lines blurred. Harker wasn't just another target. He was a complication, one Ethan didn't know how to handle. His thoughts were interrupted by the vibration of his phone. He glanced at the screen. An encrypted message from Blackhand. Your hesitation has been noted. We're sending others. Finish the job or step aside. Ethan felt his chest tighten. It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration. The guild wasn't in the habit of waiting, and they had no patience for sentimentality. His reputation wasn't just at stake. His life was. He cursed under his breath, shoving the phone into his pocket and starting the car. There was only one move left to make. He had to warn Harker. By the time he reached the outskirts of the city, the warehouse where he had last seen Harker was already under siege. Shadows moved in the darkness, the unmistakable precision of trained operatives encircling the building. The hum of drones buzzed faintly overhead, scanning for heat signatures. Ethan recognized the handiwork. Blackhand wasn't holding back. This wasn't an assassination. It was a purge. Ethan parked a safe distance away and slipped into the shadows, his heart pounding as he assessed the scene. Explosions of muffled gunfire echoed from inside, followed by the harsh crackle of radios. Harker was fighting back, and from the sounds of it, he wasn't alone. Moving with practiced ease, Ethan flanked the operatives nearest to the warehouse. He could hear their clipped voices over their comms, issuing commands and reporting on the chaos inside. Ethan didn't hesitate. One by one he disabled them, his movements swift and silent. By the time he reached the entrance, the team outside had been neutralized. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the acrid tang of burnt metal. The chaos was palpable. Shouts, gunfire, and the low whine of malfunctioning equipment filled the space. Ethan slipped through the shadows, his eyes scanning for Harker. He found him near the back of the building, crouched behind a makeshift barricade alongside two others, a young woman and an older man, both armed and bleeding. Harker's eyes narrowed when he saw Ethan approach, his grip tightening on his weapon. "You picked a hell of a time to show up." Ethan raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'm not here to kill you." "Could have fooled me," Harker snapped, his voice edged with exhaustion. "If you're not with them, then prove it." Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he turned and fired, taking down a Blackhand operative who had crept into their blind spot. The room fell silent for a moment as Harker and his companions exchanged wary glances. "Good enough for you," Ethan said, lowering his weapon. Harker didn't answer immediately, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "We need to move. They're not going to stop until this place is ashes." Ethan nodded, falling into step beside him as they made their way toward a hidden exit. The young woman, introducing herself as Mia, led the way, her movements quick despite her injuries. The older man, Jonah, covered their rear, his face grim and determined. They moved like a unit, their synchronization speaking to months, if not years, of training. As they reached the exit, the faint hum of a drone grew louder. Ethan looked up just in time to see it swoop low, its camera locking onto their position. He fired, but the drone veered away, sending a signal before crashing to the ground. "Damn it," Harker muttered. "They'll know we're here." "They already do," Ethan replied. "We need to split up. You three go. I'll slow them down." Harker hesitated, his eyes searching Ethan's face for any sign of betrayal. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe us anything." Ethan smirked, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I'm reconsidering my career choices." Harker didn't press further. With a nod, he motioned for Mia and Jonah to follow him, disappearing into the night. Ethan stayed behind, his weapon at the ready as the first wave of Blackhand operatives stormed the area. He fought with a precision born of years of experience, his movements fluid and efficient. For every step they gained, he pushed them back too. But he knew it wouldn't last. The numbers were against him. By the time Ethan retreated, his body ached with exhaustion, and his ammunition was nearly depleted. He slipped through the maze of industrial buildings, using the cover of darkness to evade his pursuers. When he finally reached his car, his hands were trembling. He wasn't sure if it was adrenaline or something else, something heavier. Driving back into the city, Ethan replayed the night's events in his mind. He had turned against his own, burned bridges that could never be rebuilt. But for the first time in years, he felt something other than the hollow satisfaction of a completed contract. He felt purpose, however fleeting. As dawn broke over the city, Ethan parked outside a run-down motel and sat in silence. He knew this wasn't over. Blackhand wouldn't stop, and neither would the forces behind Myers. The world Ethan had always navigated so carefully was unraveling, and at its center was Daniel Harker, a man who wasn't just a target, but a catalyst, pulling Ethan into a conflict far greater than he had ever imagined. Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain. He had chosen his side, and there was no turning back. Ethan woke to the sound of distant sirens, his body aching from the events of the previous night. The small motel room was dimly lit, a sliver of sunlight creeping through the curtains. He sat up slowly, wincing as his muscles protested. His mind was still racing, replaying the chaos of the raid. Harker and his group had escaped, but the cost of their freedom was mounting. Ethan had burned every bridge he had with Blackhand, and it was only a matter of time before they came for him, too. He checked his phone, the screen lighting up with an encrypted message. It wasn't from Blackhand. Instead, it was an untraceable link, sent from a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he clicked it. The screen filled with a live feed. Harker's face appeared, weary but resolute. "Ethan," Harker began, his voice steady, "you've made your choice, and I won't pretend it's an easy one. But we're not out of the woods yet. They're regrouping, and when they come, they'll bring everything they have. We can't do this alone." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What do you want from me?" "To fight," Harker said simply. "You've seen what they're capable of. You know how they operate. We need your expertise." Ethan hesitated. The thought of aligning himself so openly with Harker's cause felt like crossing a line he could never return from. But he knew the truth. Blackhand wouldn't forgive his betrayal, and the powers behind Myers wouldn't stop until Harker was dead. Survival wasn't just a question of skill anymore. It was about picking a side and committing to it fully. "I'll help you," Ethan said, his voice low. "But if this goes south, you'd better hope I don't regret it." Harker's expression softened, a flicker of gratitude breaking through his guarded demeanor. "Meet me at these coordinates," he said, the feed cutting off as quickly as it had appeared. The meeting point was an abandoned subway station on the outskirts of the city. Ethan arrived just before dusk, his every sense on high alert. The station was quiet, its graffiti-covered walls and rusting tracks giving it an eerie, forgotten air. He moved cautiously, his hand never straying far from his weapon. Harker emerged from the shadows, flanked by Mia and Jonah. They looked worse for wear, their clothes torn and stained with dried blood, but their determination was palpable. Harker wasted no time. "They'll come for us tonight," he said. "We have to be ready." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And what's the plan? Hope they trip over a loose rail?" Harker didn't smile. "We've been preparing for this. There are supplies hidden in the tunnels. Weapons, surveillance gear, even a few surprises they won't see coming. But we need time to set it all up." "And you need me to buy you that time," Ethan guessed. Harker nodded. "You're the only one who knows how they think. You can anticipate their moves, predict their strategies. Without you, we're just waiting to be overrun." Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling over him. He had faced impossible odds before, but this felt different. There was more at stake than his own survival. Whether he liked it or not, he was part of something bigger now. The hours that followed were a blur of preparation. Ethan worked alongside Harker and his team, helping to fortify the station and lay traps throughout the tunnels. Mia set up a network of motion sensors, while Jonah rigged explosives at key choke points. Harker moved between them, coordinating every detail with the precision of a seasoned tactician. As they worked, Ethan found himself watching Harker closely. There was a quiet intensity to the man, a sense of purpose that bordered on obsession. But there was also something else, a vulnerability that made him human in a way Ethan hadn't expected. Despite everything, Harker wasn't invincible. He was just a man fighting to stay alive, to protect the people who had come to depend on him. By the time night fell, the station was as ready as it could be. Ethan took up position near the main entrance, his weapon at the ready. The first sign of trouble came just after midnight. The distant hum of drones echoed through the tunnels, followed by the faint clatter of boots on metal. They were coming. Ethan signaled to Harker, who nodded and disappeared into the shadows with Mia and Jonah. Ethan remained where he was, his pulse steady as he counted the seconds. When the first operative stepped into view, Ethan fired. The man dropped instantly, his body crumpling to the ground. The others hesitated, then surged forward, their movements coordinated and efficient. The battle that followed was chaos. Ethan moved like a ghost, his shots precise and lethal. The traps they had set worked perfectly, the explosions sending shock waves through the tunnels and disorienting their attackers. But the enemy kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Harker and his team joined the fray, their combined efforts slowing the advance, but not stopping it entirely. Ethan found himself face to face with one of Black Hand's elite operatives, a man he recognized as Luther Graves. The two circled each other warily, their weapons drawn. "You're a traitor, Cole," Luther spat, his voice filled with venom. "You've turned your back on everything." Ethan didn't flinch. "I chose survival. You should try it sometime." Luther lunged, their fight a brutal clash of fists and blades. Ethan's training kept him alive, but Luther was relentless, his attacks fueled by rage. It was only by sheer luck that Ethan managed to disarm him, sending his knife clattering to the ground. He didn't hesitate, delivering a final, decisive blow that left Luther unconscious. When the last of the attackers retreated, the station was eerily silent. Ethan surveyed the damage, his body aching, but his mind sharp. They had won, but barely. Harker approached, his expression grim. "This isn't over," he said. "They'll regroup, and they'll come back stronger." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll be ready." As they stood in the wreckage, Ethan realized he had crossed the point of no return. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for a cause, a dangerous, uncertain cause, but one he was willing to see through to the end. The air in the subway station was heavy with smoke and the faint metallic tang of blood. Ethan leaned against a broken wall, his breathing steady despite the fatigue weighing on him. The battle had been won, but the victory felt hollow. He knew better than anyone that this was only the beginning. Harker's warning echoed in his mind. They would come back, stronger and deadlier than before. And next time, they wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating him. Harker approached, his movements deliberate but weary. His once pristine demeanor was replaced by the look of a man who had borne the brunt of survival for too long. Ethan watched as Harker surveyed the station, his gaze lingering on the bodies of fallen allies and enemies alike. It was clear that even victory had its cost. "They'll regroup," Harker said quietly, his voice low but firm. "This was just the first wave." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the shadows for any lingering movement. "They always do. But we bought ourselves time. What you do with it is up to you." Harker turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "You're part of this now, whether you want to be or not. They'll hunt you just as much as they hunt me. There's no going back." Ethan let the words hang in the air. He had already accepted the reality of his situation, but hearing it out loud made it feel more final. There was no safety to return to, no life outside of the war that had engulfed them both. Black Hand wouldn't forgive his betrayal, and neither would the forces behind Myers. Harker gestured for Ethan to follow him, leading him deeper into the station's network of tunnels. Mia and Jonah were waiting in what appeared to be a makeshift command center, their faces etched with exhaustion. The flickering light of a holographic map illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the walls. "We need to move," Harker said, addressing the group. "The station isn't secure anymore. They'll come back with heavier forces, and we can't afford to be here when they do." Mia nodded, her hands already working to dismantle the equipment. Jonah, however, hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Ethan. "And what about him? How do we know we can trust him?" Ethan met Jonah's gaze evenly, his voice calm but firm. "If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have fought alongside you." "That's not an answer," Jonah snapped, his tone laced with suspicion. "It's the only one you're getting," Ethan replied, his patience wearing thin. "Enough," Harker interjected, his voice cutting through the tension. "He's here because we need him. If you have a problem with that, take it up with me." Jonah didn't respond, but the look in his eyes made it clear that his doubts hadn't been erased. Ethan didn't care. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford right now, and he wasn't here to make friends. He was here to survive. As the team packed up, Harker briefed them on their next move. There was a safe house on the outskirts of the city, hidden beneath the ruins of an old industrial complex. It wasn't perfect, but it would give them the time they needed to regroup and plan their next steps. Ethan listened quietly, his mind already calculating the risks and contingencies. The journey to the safe house was uneventful, the group moving through the city's underbelly with practiced efficiency. By the time they arrived, dawn was breaking, casting a pale light over the crumbling structure. The interior was sparse but functional, its walls reinforced with steel plating, and its rooms equipped with basic supplies. Ethan took a moment to inspect the perimeter, his instincts on high alert. The safe house was well hidden, but he knew better than to assume it was impenetrable. He had spent years exploiting the weaknesses of places like this, and he could see where the defenses would falter under the right pressure. Still, it was better than nothing. Inside, the group gathered around a central table, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Harker began laying out their options, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overtake him. They had to make a choice: go on the offensive and strike at their enemies before they could regroup, or retreat further into hiding and hope to outlast the storm. Jonah argued for retreat, his voice rising as he listed the risks of engaging an enemy that outnumbered and outgunned them. Mia countered with a passionate plea for action, her determination shining through despite the weariness in her eyes. Ethan stayed silent, his gaze fixed on the map in front of him. Finally, Harker turned to him. "What do you think?" Ethan looked up, his expression unreadable. "Retreat buys you time, but it doesn't solve the problem. You'll just be running until they catch you. Going on the offensive is risky, but it's the only way to shift the balance." Harker nodded, as if he had already come to the same conclusion. "Then we fight." The next few days were a blur of preparation. The group worked tirelessly to gather intel, fortify their position, and plan their next move. Ethan found himself falling into old habits, his mind sharp as he strategized alongside Harker. Despite their differences, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a mutual respect born from necessity. When the time came, they struck with precision and ferocity. Their target was a communications hub used by their enemies to coordinate operations. The attack was swift and brutal, the team moving like a well-oiled machine. Ethan's expertise proved invaluable, his instincts guiding them through the chaos. By the time the dust settled, the hub was in ruins, and their enemies were scrambling to regroup. It wasn't a decisive victory, but it was a start. For the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of hope, a small, fragile thing, but enough to keep him going. As the group retreated to the safe house, Harker pulled Ethan aside. "You didn't have to stay," he said quietly. "You could have walked away." Ethan smirked, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe I wanted to see how this ends." Harker didn't respond, but the gratitude in his eyes said enough. For better or worse, they were in this together now, and whatever came next, Ethan was ready to face it.